classical school of thought of Thomas Robert Malthus. So, just a little introduction of Thomas Robert Malthus and his key ideas within his school of thought. First, we'll be going over the essay on the principle of population, which he published in 1798, which was then followed by British lawmakers and put into place because of his theories and ideas, that was called the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which we will get into further in the presentation. There was also a key point called the Principles of Political Economy, which he wrote too, that was published in 1820, which led to the theory of market gluts. And then getting into his growth model, which was based off population growth and how that was affected by the global food supply chains, and how he kind of put it into a model that focused on the geometrical growth rate and the arithmetical approach of how the differentiating numbers were making him come to these conclusions of his theories. So why this is important is because we need to understand the relationship in economic thought behind population growth and the focus on allocation and constraints of the resources that will ensure the sustainability of society. So that was really Malthus's key point within his theories, is the sustainability behind population growth. Some key thinkers of influence were David Hume and Marquise de Condorcet. I'm so sorry, it's French. And these were, I say, key thinkers of influence in a way where they influenced him to not want to be like them and not have the same ideas as them. He saw them more as he wanted to come up with a different idea in a way where he was opposing what the Enlightenment thinkers were thinking. So they really influenced him in a way to be different. There was a lot of critics of Malthus' school of thought because he was a very controversial man, which we will get into more into the presentation. But a lot of his critics were even his friends. So David Ricardo was his friend, but was a very big critic of him. And then there was also Amartya Sen. So just some historical background of this school of thought, Malthus' school of thought. We're going to start off at the Industrial Revolution. So by 1798, urbanization began to rapidly increase from the effects of the Industrial Revolution. Poverty and employment caused by the growing working class led Malthus to believe that the rate of production cannot keep up with the demand needed for the population. So what he was thinking, that because of all the job loss, because of the urbanizing, everyone was moving to the city, they were urbanizing the city, there wasn't enough work for everyone. They're losing their jobs. There wasn't enough food to keep everyone alive and well and safe in this ever-growing city. So what Malthus believed was he came up with a growth model to kind of show what he thought was going to happen as times continued. So he believed that population grew in a way of geometrical sort of the model. So doubling at regular intervals, which led to higher growth rates, meaning that instead of growing in an additive way where it's singular every quarter, it's going to double in size. For example, a population that's starting at 14,000 will then increase to 28,000, to then 56,000, to then 112,000. So it keeps doubling over time instead of having a rather fixed number every quarter. On the contrary, food production is going to be, in Malthus's theory, is going to be at a arithmetic rate, meaning it will be at a fixed number. It is going to be set in an additive motion that doesn't double in rate. For example, there's going to be 14,000, next there's going to be 15, 16, 17,000. There's going to be the same amount of production going in the data each time at a steady pace. Now, if you think of this in a way of population growth growing at a double rate, it's up here, then the food supply chain is going right here, and this one's growing way faster. What Malthus believes is that's not good, which would seem rather obvious, but he believed this was going to be detrimental to society. And so when you compare the numbers, it really did express concern to him. He believed that having a population of 112,000 at one time cannot support only having 17,000 of this supply when you're comparing numbers. And it makes sense on paper, but legit in some different theories and stuff, there's a lot to argue. He was a very controversial man. There could be some biases in what he believed. And for more historical background, there were the Corn Laws. So the Corn Laws were kind of tariffs that were put in place on grain to prevent any foreign competition. So landowners and farmers were getting all this money. They didn't have any competition. They had their price floor raised. So they were making rent and the price of food very, very high. And so they kept the prices high because of lack of foreign competition. This benefited the wealthy and really hurt the lower class. So keeping food at a higher cost, England, it really hurt the lower class. So England had a high reliance of imports on food since 1790, but because of the Napoleon Wars, there really wasn't much imports coming in. But after Napoleon was captured, you would expect for imports to come back in, but Parliament, who is filled of landowners, wealthy landowners, they obviously did not want to lose the revenue they were getting from rent and from agricultural grain. That they raised the price floor and they created these corn laws. Now, this obviously was not a good thing for people who did not own land, who were not farmers, and so they used what was called the poor laws. So the poor laws were government aid to help kind of fill the difference if they did not make a family did not make their wage that month. They filled, I believe they said it was the difference of how much bread was at the time, that they would get the difference of that if their family did not make that month. And so in difference, the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 was put into place because of Malthus's ideas that because of this increased poverty from higher cost of living caused for high reliance on government welfare and the poor laws that were put in place at the time. So Malthus theorized that the misery and the poverty of the lower class were facing were at their own faults. It was at their own faults that they were not restraining their population and that they did not deserve aid in the end. As I said, he was a very controversial man. And so to give aid, he stated to give aid to the poor would mean more humans could reproduce and then worsen the scarcity of resources, which is not very ethical, as you can see at the point. But a lot of landowners were in Parliament, so they did put in the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which I believed was 4 months before Malthus passed away. At least I believe it said in the reading. So this act pretty much abolished relief for everyone outside of the workhouse. Now, they made the workhouse and government aid very stigmatized in society, that some people would rather starve than receive aid from the government. They separated families. So to go to the workhouse, the men would go to this workhouse and the women and the children would go to this workhouse if they needed government aid. So it was a very stigmatized and looked down upon, that people were at ends meet, would rather just basically lead themselves to starvation rather than getting the aid that they needed from the government, which was very sad. But again, Malthus was seen and his theories were seen as a very controversial topic, and he was a very opposite of Enlightenment thinkers. That was his agenda. So getting more into Thomas Robert Malthus, and a little background in the history of who he is. He was born in 1766 and passed away in 1834, and he was born in Surrey, England. He had an education. He was from a wealthy family, and he attended Jesus College, I believe it's Jesus College, where he studied mathematics, theology, and philosophy. He then later pursued his studies at Cambridge, where he was introduced to economics and actually some of Adam Smith's ideas, where he did also get some things he did not want to believe in and what he'd rather be the opposition of from Adam Smith's ideas. After university, he then actually became an ordained minister at the Church of England in 1797. A little background of him: he was actually, as I said before, he was born into a very wealthy family. He was the son of Daniel Malthus, who was friends with and very closely connected to, I'm going to butcher this name, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And David Hume, who were well-known Enlightenment thinkers. And so he grew up and was around these Enlightenment thinkers, and same with his father. His father had a lot of more progressive ideas, and he saw these ideas as he did not agree with his ideas, rather I say. And he was more of an opposition and wanted to think of something different than these people that he grew up with. So yeah, he based his theories, most of opposing theories, off these people. And so his economic ideas, as stated previously, were his Principles of Political Economy in 1820 and an essay on the principle of population that was published in 1798. So getting into some of the key thinkers that influenced them, Malthus, more of, not in a good way, but just going off of why he opposed these key thinkers and how they were so different from him. And so, born in Edinburgh, Scotland, David Hume was born in 1756 and passed away in 1836. His education was from the University of Edinburgh, where he studied classical literature, philosophy, and the law at a very young age. He did not finish his degree. Even though he was a groundbreaking Enlightenment thinker, he didn't finish his degree, and he was there actually at a very young age. I think I was believing I read 12 years old when he went to university, so he was a very bright young man. And he was actually born to a well-off family, but he was expected to pursue law. And after his father passed away, who also pursued law, but he took the philosophy route and became one of the most well-known key Enlightenment thinkers. He was a very progressive and socially entwined, thinking that people can fix a society themselves. That population growth really does not matter when it comes to the economic world. It matters in a way, but not in a way that Malthus thinks is very detrimental. So some of his key economic ideas was he wrote The Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which was groundbreaking. It theorized that the cause and effect of human nature were in a cause and effect cycle, and Malthus had a more pessimistic view of this, and he disagreed and was very opinionated on his thoughts of Hume's, and that he didn't really see the capability of rationalism and emotion within a society. He didn't believe that there could be any progressive actions taken within a society, that they can fix themselves almost. He saw it straightforward that this is the population growth, it's going to decline unless there's some things that can be done, which he did mention, that we will talk about more into the presentation, but were quite controversial as well. Another influential key thinker who was closely connected to his father, Daniel Malthus, I'm going to butcher this name again, Marquis de Condorcet. I'm so sorry. He was born in 1743 and passed away in 1794, and he was born in Ribemont, France. And his education was Jesuit College in Reims and the College de Nevers in Paris, where he studied mathematics and philosophy. His background, he came from a noble family, and he was also a French Enlightenment thinker, which you can see why didn't really get along with him, and who served in a part of the French Revolution. So I was actually reading that he kind of came on bad terms with someone who was part of the revolution. And when he was captured, he mysteriously passed away. I thought that was a little fun fact about Marquis de Condorcet. But he was a very, very big Enlightenment thinker that was friends with Malthus. And so economic ideas theorized much similar to Hume, to the hunger and poverty that can be solved through a better agricultural means and fairer wealth distribution and equality. He advocated for democracy and a universal education. A growing population was not a threat to society, and at modern times with technology, be able to keep up. So he did believe that a growing population, yeah, it's a factor in economics, but it's really not going to be a very big problem when technology can keep up and labor can keep up with it at the times. So Malthus created his oppositions off of this, and he did see Hume's and all these key Enlightenment thinkers as disconnected from reality and almost living in a utopian reality. So he was a very pessimistic man in his thinkings of economics, but it was very interesting to learn about the history and the influencing key thinkers of his thoughts and the thoughts behind that.
I was going to start with his population theory. He wrote about this population theory in a series of editions of works called An Essay on the Principle of Population. Now, this was a work that he constantly was, for lack of a word, upgrading. Like, he did this throughout like 30 years of his career. He was constantly building upon himself and like going over his past ideas and correcting them if he saw something that has changed in society at the time, or he was doubling down. We'll see like a little bit of this in the next couple of slides. I did put like a quote I think really sums all of the essays up, and it set out to account for much of that poverty and misery observable among the lower class of every nation. So this is obviously at a time where economics was kind of just beginning, or at least the study of it, and he was just really trying to understand how the economy was working and how it was actually being structured at the time. And we will learn like throughout this that he, some of his ideas were actually pretty antiquated and did not make sense in a current world, but at the time he was really seeking out to explain things that were unexplainable at the time. So one of his big things was that population increases geometrically. Geometrically meaning that every 25 years, in his theory, it doubles. So it goes from, i.e., 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. It's basically like the power of doubling. I think that, at the time it really made sense, and what he was observing, what he was writing about was what he was observing. And the substance increases arithmetically, i.e., 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And substance is the market when you're not talking about the market, you're talking about like resources and stuff like that. So it's two different things. He identified two types of checks for population growth, and that would be preventative checks and positive checks. So my next slide, I kind of go into more what that is. So preventative checks is reduced to birth rate. Birth rate would be in regards to actual births of people who were alive. I was kind of confused about that, but it's birth rate is just simply someone who was born. And he believed that birth rate, there was two different things that you have to take into account with birth rate. So there's moral restraint. Moral restraint, he was approved by Malthus. He thought people who had moral restraint when it came to reducing the birth rate were good people. As you'll see throughout this, he kind of does like entwine his own like beliefs and morality into how he views economics. So he was basically saying, in the moral restraint was that if people who couldn't afford children could either postpone or never marry. So he was basically saying that is the good way out of not having kids. If you're going to reduce the birth rate, then you should be reducing the birth rate by postponing and never getting married. Now, he described the opposite of that, or disapproved of. He called these vices, and these vices were people who indulged in prostitution, birth control. Basically, in his view, these people were not doing their duty of having more children and kind of supplying more workers to this this ever-growing economy that he was seeing. He does reference multiple times when it comes to these preventative checks. When it comes to these preventative checks, he references the laziness of the human race, and he through like the preventative checks, we kind of see where his viewpoint is, and his viewpoint is definitely more of he's interested in building a working population rather than human reproduction. So he wasn't really worried about the actual birth of the person and how they would run with society, just like as a human being. He was looking at it more from a working standpoint and how they would benefit society and how they would grow and how their labor could be used to grow the economy to something better. And then now we have positive checks. So positive checks is called increasing the death rate. So that's when we're talking about famines, misery, plague, war. These are just unfortunate evils that required to limit the population. He thinks they represented punishments for those who didn't demonstrate moral restraint. Again, he is interjecting his own kind of opinion onto how the economy was running. So as you can see, both of the preventative checks and positive checks have to do with obviously a decrease in population. The positive check especially, he was basically saying that people who were not doing things out of moral restraint, i.e., prostitution, birth control, all that stuff, were the people who were dying, who were increasing the death rate. And that's why they're being punished. That's why they were no longer in society. And for the second part, we're going to have the Paul's implication, which is the poor laws. One part of it, he said he believed there should be no government relief for the poor as the natural punishment for not practicing moral restraint. Again, he's introducing his own, personal agenda, and he's basically saying that, the poor don't deserve government relief. So he would have hated welfare. That's basically it. He would have hated the idea of welfare. I mean, as I said right here, as he got older, his views definitely became a little less harsh on the poor. But he maintained his original point of he did not believe that the government should be helping people who were poor, because in his eyes, if you're poor, then that means you're going against the moral restraint. That means that you didn't do your due diligence and not have children or not get married. So it's your fault you're poor. And some of these ideas that he references were enacted in the Poor Law Amendment of 1834. And it basically abolished all relief for able-bodied people outside of workhouses. To qualify for relief, a man must have to pawn off all of his possessions and then enter the workhouse, and along with his wife and children. And if they couldn't enter the workhouse, I believe they had to go to a cotton mill. And basically, they set it up in a way where it made needing public assistance so embarrassing and so socially just outcasting people for needing public assistance that people were starving instead of subjecting themselves to being put into the public assistance system. Which obviously makes sense when you look into, his preventative checks and positive checks. And it's another form of punishment, because he's basically punishing those who are poor for asking for help. And that's how the Poor Law Amendment used the Malthus idea to kind of come up with the deterrent of using these government assistance. And the next thing that he really pushed was the theory of market gluts. Now, he also had other things besides these two, but these are the two main ones that we're going to be going over. Part of it was written in this book called The Principles of Political Economy. one of these theories was a theory of the potential insufficiency of effective demand. So I'm just kind of going to go over the bullet points and then I'll kind of go more in depth. So basically, he assumed workers received subsistence wage. And he said that employers hire workers basically because they produce a value greater than wages received. So therefore, the employer makes a profit. The profit cannot transform to higher wages because production employment would cease to exist. So basically, the subsistence wage is basically like, for those three bullet points, to just like break them down, what he's saying is when an employer hires a worker, the worker's value in the company and their labor will always be worth more than the wages received. And that's how the employer makes a profit. So he cannot like raise the wages, because if he were to raise the wages, then the production employment would cease to exist, because he needs the work to be worth more than the product in order for him to make money. That's basically the gist of like those three. He believed that the capitalists buy extra output in form of capital goods, and that stimulates production and employment. The consumption of workers employed in productive labor never sufficient to accumulate and employ capital. So let me break down those two like bullet points. And he's basically saying the capitalists are going to buy that extra output. They're going to buy, the things that these workers are creating, and that's going to stimulate production and employment, because the more capitalists buy this, the capitalist goods or the capital goods, it's more money into the employer's pocket. More money into the employer's pocket. They're able to hire more workers. They hire more workers. You're able to produce more. And the consumption of workers employed in productive labor is never sufficient to accumulate and employ capital. So basically, he's saying that the workers will never accumulate and gain the capital they're making. So like if, for example, a worker is making a good, that worker will never be able to afford said good in large quantity or in the scope of a capital good, if that makes sense. They will never be in the position of the capitalist. They will always be the worker. And the investment leads to consumption of capital. So again, the capitalists are investing in the capital. Capitals can consume their own profit, but instead they're too busy in counting houses. So basically what he was saying with that was like, in theory, capitalists should be able to gain a lot of profit off of the investments that they're putting back into these into these capital goods. But a lot of them are too busy just being socialites and being rich and being in banks. So again, he's kind of adding his own little 2 cents into how he feels that the people who are holding more power, like the capitalists, are in society. Another point was that the need for unproductive consumption. So he was really big on this whole like the landlords and rent thing. So landlords are essential to avoid the glut of goods. So basically he's saying like, in order for people to not overbuy, you have to have landlords. There needs to be rental properties available, because it controls their ability for people to just keep buying more and more and more and not building an effective demand. So basically it is connected to the top point. And for rent was a surplus based on the difference between the price of an agricultural produce and the cost of productions. So it adds to demand, but not cost of production, necessary to like avoid like an economic, I forgot the proper terminology. It was cut off on my slide, but it's basically what he's saying is when you get rent, you're adding to demand, but not the cost. So like by receiving the money for rent, you are able to garner and like get the demand, because they're like obviously paying you for this product, but it doesn't affect the cost reduction, as in it doesn't affect the like making the actual product. So for the policy implications, that basically said that corn laws are a must. The corn laws were talked about in the previous slide, but they are basic tariffs on imported grain and enrich the landlords and consequently promote unproductive consumption. And it avoids economic stagnation. So basically, one of the big points he had was like, you want to avoid economic stagnation, and you want the economy to keep growing and keep expanding upon itself. And he believed that the corn laws were a big way to do that. And it was subsequently just by putting tariffs on like grain and stuff like that. And he opposed excessive unproductive consumption financed by the government. He didn't like when people lived on interest of national debt, because it led to less wealth. Basically, he's saying, again, he would not be a fan of welfare. He did not believe that people should be living off of the government, because it makes the national debt higher, and that leads to less wealth, and less wealth is less of wealthy people, and it becomes like, again, he's trying to avoid people getting stuck into this poverty cycle, or at least that's how he's trying to spin it or view it. He believed that private property should be sacred and not allow redistribution of wealth through high taxes. So we'll say it in the next slide, but he was basically saying that like we should not be taxing the wealthy through high taxes, because then it would distribute the money too well. And that really connects back to his whole preventative checks and positive checks. he basically believes that the poor should stay poor because they deserve it, because they're not moral, and the rich should stay rich because they've obviously done something in order to garner that wealth. He implied that wars offered stimulus that could eliminate gluts, which does make sense in his theories of potential insufficiencies and like the effective demand. Because once again, war will stimulate the economy. It's a known idea within economics that when there is war, we work more efficiently, and our demand for a lot of things is very high, and we're able to tap into new markets that we usually aren't able to during non-war time. And then we have the recommended government spending on public works, and he said that could solve acute economic problems. So he was basically saying that he recommended that when we're having economic issues, like smaller ones, he said they should, look into public works such as like parks, things of that nature. And basically, he was trying to insinuate that by putting these public spaces out there, you would not only stimulate the economy through new jobs, but also give people a place to go to, possibly make more money and benefit the economy as a whole. So now we're just going to go over.
Okay, so obviously, you've already had the introduction to Malthus and some of his endeavors and the ideas that he pushed, and we're going to talk about some of the benefits and the consequences that were seen because of what he did. And so the prompt obviously is to analyze whom the school of thought or the individual thinkers sought to benefit. Did their ideas primarily benefit a certain social class, government, business, or general society? And to explore the intended and unintended consequences of their ideas on different stakeholders. In this situation, stakeholders would just be people in England, which is where they were. And so getting into it, who did Malthus seek to benefit? Obviously, through a lot of the stuff that he did, it was really just to benefit the upper class. We'll get into it a little bit later, but there's a lot talked about wealth defense and other things. But to start off, Malthus's theory particularly supported it for the Corn Laws, and the opposition to the government relief for the poor aligned with the interests of landed gentry and wealthy elite. His ideas supported policies that allowed the rich to retain their wealth and influence, especially during a period when their power was being challenged by the rise of industrial capitalists and the working class. Obviously, the Corn Laws, Malthus favored the retention of these laws, which imposed tariffs on imported grain, thus keeping domestic grain prices and land rents high. This policy directly benefited landlords, but resulted in higher food prices for the poor. This is just kind of a typical economic move that would negatively affect. I mean, this is very basic economics, but it makes perfect sense. Not being able to import for cheaper and having to produce for higher prices is not necessarily beneficial at all for the lower class. Also, the population theory that poverty and suffering were inevitable consequences of an unchecked population growth. That was Malthus's big thing, is that if you leave population unchecked, it just continues to grow. And that the population really, this is the one thing that led to a lot of wealth, like the wealth defense thing that I was just talking about, where this kind of gave all the intellectual reasoning to believe that being poor was inevitable, and that the wealthy didn't really have to do anything to help out with it. And according to Malthus, aiding the poor would only exacerbate overpopulation and greed and lead to greater misery, meaning that the more that you help these people, the worse off that they're going to be, because they're going to continue to grow with no actual foundation. And it would kind of just end up, I don't know, the idea of this is that in society would just even everything out, because all the wealth is up here and all the poor people are here. Eventually it meets in the middle, and then it flattens out. But this is just kind of one of the examples where if you were to aid the poor, as soon as the aid is done, you won't have much of an opportunity to, like, the poor people just are left kind of waiting for more with no difference done to their society. So that was his kind of theory on why not to help. Malthus's economic thought, particularly his own population theory, was most definitely not designed to benefit the poor people. And it wasn't necessarily made to benefit the upper class as well, but it ended up doing that just because people used it as reasoning to not help. And they were most definitely aligned with the interests of the upper classes, with the governments and landowners and property elites. So how did they affect or how did it help the government? Obviously, in econ, government spending is a classic thing. Malthus's ideas on limiting the relief for the poor and discouraging government intervention in welfare obviously aligned with the conservative interests of a British government by opposing the expansion of poor laws. And welfare policies, Malthus advocated for a smaller government role in social and economic affairs, a stance that reduced the fiscal burden on the state. Which, I mean, if you think about that, even in the US, there are a lot of people that are not too excited about giving a lot of like people that aren't like giving the poor people money, really. People that are rich want to hold on to their money. They feel like they've worked very hard for it and don't believe that sending money to people that have not earned it makes sense because it's just that's just how they feel about it. And it makes sense because reducing government spending, uh, especially in a time like this, is it's ideal, I think. And to not to have to then have Malthus come in as like a sound reasoning, like here's an economist that is like here's an economist that's actually producing this information and it makes sense that poverty is inevitable and that helping out a bunch and spending a bunch of government money to reduce poverty isn't actually going to do anything in the long run. So they kind of just stopped helping. But we'll get a little bit more into that with the workhouses. But it definitely didn't benefit the government. And then some of the consequences that you'd see is that Malthus just got straight into blaming the poor. He argued that poverty was largely a result of the poor's inability to practice moral restraint, particularly their failure to limit reproduction rather than systemic societal issues. So instead of taking anything like anything into the picture, he really only came down to the moral restraint and to limit reproduction. Obviously, there's many other things that you could consider in terms of population expanding, but I mean, to be realistic, there's only one way that a population expands. So to blame everything on a potential moral restraint, it kind of makes sense, but it's kind of like an indecent thing to think about because you're not thinking about things holistically. Also, I mean, this is exactly to that same point. Instead of examining factors like unequal land distribution, labor exploitation, and insufficient wages, it all came down to behavior as the root cause of poverty, when in reality, if you were to use that reasoning today, I don't think that the internet would like that very much. By placing the responsibility for poverty on the poor themselves, Malthus provided a convenient justification for the wealthy and the government to avoid addressing deeper economic and social inequalities. So that was kind of to the point that I was making earlier. Basically, the idea with this is just they're taking his theories, put all of the blame on them, on the poor people, and so it justified the government and the wealthy to believe that they didn't have anything to do with it and therefore will not help with it. And that just is not necessary. It's just that doesn't work. And the suffering of the poor was framed on natural consequence of overpopulation, which implied that poverty was inevitable and not a problem to be solved through social or economic reforms. Again, same thing, doesn't change anything. Just Malthus believing that it came down to consequence of overpopulation, not anything like unequal land distribution, labor exploitation, or any other reasons. This perspective discouraged the, I mean, again, same thing. Obviously, in general, it discourage the wealthy from engaging in charitable efforts or supporting policies. And again, because it only suggested that it would exacerbate overpopulation and poverty in the long run. So you might help things in the short run, but you're not going to change anything down the line. Another thing it led to was the defense of wealth. So, I mean, it's all coming back to the exact same thing the entire time. But by framing poverty as an inevitable consequence of population growth, it was an intellectual defense for the concentration of wealth among the landed classes. It reinforced existing social hierarchies and helped maintain the power and privilege of the upper classes at a time when industrialization and urbanization were increasing pressures of social reform. As Malthus believed that poverty was inevitable and that there really wasn't anything the wealthy could do to alleviate it, instead the poor were responsible for their own population growth, taking all the responsibility off of the rich people and putting all the responsibility on the poor people, blaming population as the reasoning for their poverty. And then it was also true that Malthus's view were influential in shaping the harsh poor law amendment of 1834, which abolished outdoor relief, which was aid given to the poor outside workhouses for able-bodied people. Under this new system, only those willing to enter workhouses, which were deliberately made to be unpleasant and degrading, would receive this assistance. This law had devastating effects on the poor, which broke up families and subjected them to humiliating conditions in workhouses. This is one of those things where if you're really trying to deter people from doing something, I mean, I like a really basic, well, not a basic example because it's a pretty serious example. Um, I think that if you have, I mean, it's really just, I mean, if you really need it that bad, then people are going to go into these workhouses and allow themselves to be subjected to a broken up family and humiliation. But that's if you really need it. Most of the time, when you affect somebody on a personal level, they will most likely find or figure out a way to make it happen without it. So the demand drops for it significantly because they don't want any part of that, and they feel like then now they have agency over what they can do. But it's just kind of a tough thing to put like put a social class into because of all the things that they have to be all the things that they have to do in order to get any aid. When realistically they were probably living in very brutal living conditions, and all around just did not encourage. Well, to Malthus's point, would not encourage population growth. So they kind of like suffocated them from a government level. And then obviously, another consequence that comes with this is just increased poverty and social unrest. It actually, I believe that it could possibly have done an opposite effect, which again is to the point of Malthus and what their goal was. But by opposing government intervention and welfare on the poor, it led to worsening poverty, which especially during economic downturns. His belief that aid would only exactly like keeping aid from those in need really only led to like a contribution and increased suffering and deprivation, which obviously comes as no surprise. If you take aid away from the people that need it, I don't know how you're going to expect that they're going to do well with anything. And so increased suffering and deprivation only makes sense. I mean, especially if you think about it too, because if you raise the prices of corn and then took away aid, the net pay that people in the poor class had to spend to then buy it, it's just everything is just more expensive that way. Then the lack of government support for the poor and rising inequality during the Industrial Revolution fueled social unrest. The working class, struggling with low wages and poor living conditions, became increasingly discontented with this existing social order. Malthus's ideas, which justified the suffering of the poor as inevitable, likely intensified the resentment between classes. It's just exactly what you'd expect. Obviously, at some point the working and middle class gets tired of it, and it just leads to increased social unrest. That's what you see all around the world when stuff like this happens. You even see it in the U.S. today. Prices are going up. Social media is obviously the new outlet for people's feelings and things that they are upset about, and so that's where we are today. But it's not like that's changed at all. They just did it differently then. And so then to think about the overall effects that Malthus had, we're talking about growth, equality, or stability. Let's look at that. So Malthus's economic ideas primarily sought to maintain stability rather than promote growth or equality, which very obviously can be seen through what I've just explained. But there was not a whole lot of growth or equality being done. Stability definitely was the theme of a lot of Malthus's population theory. But in terms of stability, Malthus's ideas were centered around the belief that population growth, if unchecked, would lead to social and economic instability through famine, poverty, and war. His proposed solutions, which was moral restraint and limited aid to the poor, were intended to stabilize society by ensuring that the population growth remained within the limits of available resources. However, this goal of stability was largely focused on preserving the status quo, which benefited the wealthy and the powerful at the expense of the poor. So it didn't really there was no growth there. You could almost say that there was stability, kind of, because the wealth and the poor, or the wealthy and the powerful, got to feel their own stability. But there was no stability, growth, or equality for the poor or working middle class. Given that Malthus was skeptical of unchecked economic growth, particularly as it relied on increasing population, that was not one of his goals, and so including that in this it doesn't really make sense. There's nothing growth oriented about these ideas. In fact, they were pretty much anti-growth. He didn't want the population to grow. He didn't want poverty to grow. He didn't want just everything he talked about was just anti-growth. And then with that, when you separate two classes and you want one like where you want the lower class to not grow at all, then becomes a question of equality. They most definitely, in fact, did not promote equality. Obviously, his theories reinforced existing inequalities and kind of just made things worse. And so, in general, it's looking back on all of it. He, you could say that Malthus was right in his idea that that population is like if there are more people, it's hard to take care of more people. If you help the poor out and give them welfare, you don't actually benefit them. Just an interesting side part about me. I've lived in Africa for 10 years. I've lived in Kenya, Tanzania, and Senegal. And you hear all about these mission trips that travel out to Kenya, that travel out to Tanzania, that do the beautiful parts of Africa. And they go into villages and they give them money and they build them schools and they give them books and they give them like just all sorts of stuff that won't last long term. Or I'd say, for example, a village doesn't have like they have to walk 2 miles to get water every day. And somebody comes in and builds a well only like a couple 100 meters away from there, or like even in their village. When that well works for 10 years, when that well breaks, or if that well stops working, that you've built a generation that has learned to be comfortable with that environment. Now, where it changes it, I mean, yeah, and it's the same thing with this. Like if you spend all your time giving people aid, it takes away a lot of their responsibility for themselves, and they kind of just freeload. And honestly, I don't really see anything wrong with that theory. Obviously, it feels like a very inhumane idea. But in reality, you don't set people up for success by giving things to them. They don't learn anything through that. And when you have finite amounts of resources, there's just not a whole lot that you can do with it. So in conclusion for this section, I think Malthus had the right idea, but when they went into action, it really didn't help much. And I think that's why stuff like this happens, is that you can see things that happen in the past and understand that they won't work in the future.
Hi, my name is Joseph, and I'll be going over our section on value in their time. Most of Malthus's writings stemmed from two controversies that were affecting England at the time. First being the increasing amount of poverty and what could be done to stop it. And the second controversy revolved over the Corn Laws. These were laws that placed tariffs on grain being imported into England, and this essentially established a minimum price or a price floor for all imported grain in the country. And because of England's growing population, they saw an increase in the need to import food. However, the ongoing Napoleonic Wars kept the amount of imports low, and this, coupled with the tariffs placed on grain imports, resulted in extremely high prices for food. These tariffs were favored by the wealthy landlords of England, but were being challenged by the fast-growing merchant class and other middle-class groups. Once the war ended in 1813 with Napoleon's capture, the landlords who benefited from the high rent and grain prices were afraid that increasing the amount of grain imports would decrease the price of grain greatly and reduce rental costs. To offset this, these landlords used their position in Parliament to raise the price floors that had been placed on grain. Malthus is most famous for his essay titled An Essay on the Principle of Population, which was published in 1798. In this essay, Malthus presented his theories on population growth and the implications of leaving population growth unchecked. According to his theories, if left unchecked, population growth would overtake food production and lead to famine. In his essay, he wrote, "It may be safely asserted, therefore, that population, when unchecked, increases in a geometrical progression of such a nature as to double itself every 25 years. If setting out from a tolerably well-peopled country, such as England, France, Italy, or Germany, we were to suppose that, by great attention to agriculture, its produce could be permanently increased every 25 years by a quantity equal to that which it at present produces, it would be allowing a rate of increase decidedly beyond any probability of realization. Yet this would be a arithmetical progression and would fall short, beyond all comparison, of the natural increases of population in a geometrical progression." Basically, he believed that if left unchecked, the rate at which population's growth rate increased would eventually surpass society's production of food. According to this According to this model, the rate of population growth and the rate of food production both increase in 25-year intervals. However, the rate at which population growth increases exceeds the rate at which food production increases. Therefore, agriculture will not be able to keep up with the demand for food if population growth is not regulated. The solutions he presented in this essay revolved around slowing population growth through means such as family planning and birth control. He referred to solutions that slowed the growth of the population by reducing the birth rates as preventative checks. Some of his proposed preventative checks were avoiding marriage, prostitution, and birth control. He also urged those who cannot afford it to avoid having children. Malthus also recognized positive checks to population in his essay. These are checks that would increase the death rate. They include things like famine, misery, plague, and war. Malthus refers to these as natural phenomena or laws. He believed that while they were unfortunate, they were required if society was going to advance. At the time of publishing this essay, Malthus was 32 years old. And the reason I bring this up is because he was relatively young when compared to his peers. And they saw his propositions as being too rash and overly enthusiastic at times. As for how he was received at the time, most of his theories were heavily debated, especially his policies for limiting population growth or preventative checks. His critics argued that his theories were overly pessimistic and cannot be supported by existing evidence at the time. Most of his proposed preventative checks, such as postponing or never marrying, went against the most popular religious beliefs of his time and only added to his controversial nature. Supporters of his theories saw them as a warning, believing his theory that unchecked population growth would eventually lead to famine to be true. His theories were also held in high regard by wealthy landlords in particular, and this is because under his school of thought, they were absolved of any wrongdoing when it came to the causes of poverty. His theories also stated that spending from landlords was essential to the economy, because without spending from the wealthy, the economy would stagnate. He also disapproved of government spending in the form of outright assistance, instead proposing that in times of acute economic stress, the government should be spending on public works. This way, the government could increase the demand of labor by actively hiring people to work on the construction of roads and other infrastructures. As I discussed before, many were critical of Malthus's belief for a need to slow population growth because his proposed solutions went against the current moral and religious beliefs of the time. Many economists also disagreed with his views on the issues plaguing society, contesting his beliefs that overpopulation is the root cause of all the problems plaguing society. They also disagreed with his theory that the poor were only poor because of their own actions, and disagreed with his solutions that only placed the burden on the poor, while basically saying that the wealthy shouldn't have to sacrifice anything. Some scholars even believe that he was more interested in maintaining a large, hard-working, poorly paid population, rather than finding a way to effectively limit the growth of the population. And some argued that he was simply too young to be making these arguments, and this is because at the time of writing, as I mentioned before, he was 32 years old. And if you go back and read later renditions of this essay, his arguments seem to have matured as he grew older, and they were seen as more rational. Next up, we have his lasting contributions to economic thought, and his biggest contributions were his theories on population growth. Those theories later went on to serve as a baseline in discussions on resource scarcity and government assistance. Malthus was also responsible for developing the theory of diminishing returns. He originally intended to apply the theory to agriculture, but we use it in many types of production today. And although he was seen as controversial for his time, future economists went on to build upon the foundations he laid out. Many of his theories can be applied to developing nations today. In 2011, famine washed over the Horn of Africa, affecting multiple nations. Population growth reached 3% in the region, and this contributed to the famine at the time. However, the bigger contributors to the famine were conflict and drought. The reason I bring this up is because war was one of the positive checks of the population that Malthus discussed. And as I said earlier, he saw these as an unfortunate but necessary evil. And without them, society would fail to progress. Pair war with the failure of the local governments to provide aid, and the famine would unfortunately only increase, and it led to tens of thousands dying in the region. As we discussed earlier, Malthus's theories are still prevalent in modern economics. His theories influenced the development of things such as government assistance, government work plans, and public spending. His thoughts on population control also influenced discussions on family planning, birth control, and government-mandated population control. To conclude, Malthus's theories helped shape modern-day economic thought, even though his views were seen as controversial for his time. Many of the theories he discussed in his first essay can be applied to developing nations in the modern day. He was known for proposing theories that absolved the wealthy of any responsibility that had to do with poverty, instead choosing to place the blame on the poor no matter how they ended up in that position. And he was widely known for his theories on population control and how to slow the growth of the population for the betterment of society. Thank you.